Be very much welcome to this podcast from AVT Business School, Voices of a Business School, as we call these. And this special edition, we have a few of them in connection with the launch of our Executive Life Science Diploma program here in the fall of 2024, and we're interviewing faculty members and lecturers on the program. And today we have another distinguished lecturer, both on the program and also lecturing a little bit maybe on this podcast, which is Sarah Rickwood, which is the salt leader for the EMEA region at IQVIA. And I know Sarah's going to feel a little bit about her background. She's much better than I am doing that, but she had a very distinguished career in the industry. And has a background educated at Oxford, but I've had the pleasure of meeting always often as a keynote Sarah at various conferences around Europe. But maybe you would fill in a little bit about your background and experience for the audience, and then we can get on a little bit on the content.
Thank you, Casper, and thank you for inviting me to talk on this podcast. So, in terms of background, I've always worked in the life sciences and healthcare industries. And for much of my career, I've worked in IQVIA or its precursor companies. Now, IQVIA is quite unique in the sense that it is the company which has the most data on the trends in the commercial prescription medicines market. And at a point in my career, that really intrigued me to understand how new active substances, innovative prescription medicines launch, and how they do in terms of commercial return across countries, what affects that, what drives the launch environment. So I started writing about launch excellence in 2007. A very different prescription medicine market to the market we have now. We were looking at launches from the late 1990s through to the early 2000s at that point. And it hit a nerve, I think, with pharmaceutical companies, because they do want to ensure that the investment that they've made in bringing a prescription medicine market to approval and use is one that they get the best possible return on, not just for themselves in order to be able to invest further in research and development, but also for the patients who are seeking new treatments. So we've been publishing on the question of launch excellence once every couple of years ever since then, and we've seen considerable change in the launch environment, particularly, of course, post-COVID, because of that. Mm-hmm.
Very good. Thank you very much for teeing up the theme of today and on the program, these things that can create value for all the stakeholders in the healthcare industry. And as you nicely framed it, today we're going to talk about launch and launch excellence. And it really fits into what we do on the program in terms of going to market strategy. So how do you create most value for the stakeholders? Also, maybe after you through some of the innovation process and so on, some of the other themes on the program. So in reading the latest version, and once again, impressive to see how you followed the theme with you and IQVIA over the year. Maybe just start out. What are some of the highlights here of the latest kind of overview of launch excellence that you have published in the white paper?
Sure. So the paper we're talking about is Launch Excellence 8, and that was published in the middle of 2023. And we're looking at 8 major markets. It's the US, top 5 European countries, and Japan, because those are typically 90% of the first 5-year cumulative sales of a new active substance. Sorry, I should have added that China has also joined those core markets that we look at. It's the only new country to enter the core launch markets in the last decade and a half. The environment that we have now, and this is one of the key discussion points within the paper, is a really, really challenging environment for new active substance launch. Except, of course, for the COVID vaccines and treatments, which up to the last year or so anyway, were unsurprisingly extremely strong. And the reason why the post-pandemic environment is particularly challenging, there's definitely been a trend break, is because of the ways the pandemic impacted on the healthcare system that had differentially challenging consequences when you are introducing a new medicine into that system. What I mean by this is really sort of threefold. So firstly, we know that healthcare systems were hugely challenged and made fragile by the pandemic, and that's not history. It's still the case now. We are still seeing healthcare professional burnout and resignation and stretched resources. We are still seeing suboptimal treatment of patients and working through backlogs. We are still seeing budgetary challenges. That's not a good environment to successfully introduce your new innovation. Any company launching a new product has to think of how they are going to address an environment that is less than optimal for introducing new innovation. Point number one. Secondly, for launching your product as a pharmaceutical company, it's really important to be able to engage with healthcare professionals interactively, to answer their questions, to respond to their perspectives about new products, to be able to introduce that launch product. Unsurprisingly, in 2020, we saw a huge trend break in the ability of pharma to engage with healthcare professionals. Everything went virtual. And since then, we've been slowly moving back to a situation where doctors are talking to pharmaceutical companies' representatives, again, in the real world. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at the IQVIA data, the volume of interactive engagement, whether that interactive engagement is real world or it's virtual, a call or a Teams meeting or whatever, has not come back to the levels of volume that you saw prior to the pandemic in Europe or Japan or China. Now, it has in the US, and that makes a split between the US and the other markets that really, really matter for your launch products. But if you're a pharmaceutical company and you're launching a product, you've got to live with the reality that you may have fewer opportunities to engage with the doctors that matter about your launch product at the moment. Each one matters more. And the last point is a point that isn't just triggered by the pandemic, but the pandemic certainly did not make it any better, which is we live in times of budgetary constraint for healthcare systems and therefore for prescription medicine products. And if we think about what's going to happen going forward, where we will have continued demands on healthcare budget from great new innovation in specialty areas like oncology, but we're going to be facing new demands in areas like obesity, that's not going to change anytime soon. So you have healthcare system capacity gaps, you have challenges in interacting and engaging doctors, and you have budgetary challenges. And the triple combination means that launches, on average, there are exceptions, just are doing less well in terms of sales uptake than pre-pandemic peers.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for a very elaborate and I was only intrigued by taking notes, even though I prepared for this podcast already, and being a learning person here. If I may, so maybe jump down into one of them to start out around engagement. And I noted that there's maybe two aspects to it. One is there's a difference between the US and some of the other countries here that we're looking into. So the first question and the later one later on, do you need kind of a dual launch strategy to do that? Maybe have a different kind of channel mix, and especially outside the US, how do you mitigate that lower level of engagement that's possible, or are there any success stories how to come around it?
Okay, well, what we found in the Launch Excellence 8 was in this general environment of lower volumes of interactive engagement, the really commercially successful launches, the launches that outperformed in terms of sales uptake, were getting higher than average levels of engagement volume. So they're swimming against the tide. Now, they may be doing that for a number of reasons. One of them may be that in many, possibly not all cases, though, these are products that are inherently interesting for doctors to engage on because they are important step changes in treatment for a given therapy area. We did find, for example, that orphan medicines tended to be resilient in the post-pandemic environment. And one of the learnings from that, because of course not every launch is going to be a first-in-class product in an area of incredibly high unmet need. Some are important steps forward, but they're incremental steps forward, is how can you create relevant new research for your product? For example, real-world studies that doctors actually find useful and want to understand about because they provide useful insight for the treatment of patients. So that's something that companies need to think about. How do we create relevant, useful research content? The second thing we noticed about the launches that did well was they had a higher proportion, often, of interactive engagement that was virtual, even though face-to-face engagement with doctors has returned to a greater or lesser extent across countries, even though if you poll doctors, they emphasize the importance of that face-to-face engagement and relationship. The fact of the matter is, when you're launching a product, there will be some doctors that you cannot reach in the real world that are still important for your launch. You need to be able to reach them. And I think what the companies that were behind the really excellent launches did was they made the fullest use of the channels that they had available to them to engage all the doctors that were important and relevant to the uptake of their launch product. And if that had to be virtual, then it was virtual.
Great. Thanks for a very, very precise answer, and also how you can use different challenges about what the success stories tells us. I'm very curious about the use you said of also of use of evidence, or the evidence thresholds, as you also describe it in the report. To elaborate a little bit on that, so aggregating, as you just mentioned, more real world evidence, also to show the cost benefit likely, but also maybe you look at the trend of maybe looking at patient outcomes. What kind of other things? Once again, when you have limited budgets and so on, is that how do you work in that space to maybe demonstrate the value of your product towards payers and so on, both in terms of real world evidence, but maybe also in outcome? Any examples of that?
Okay. Well, I think that I'm going to start with a general trend, and then I am going to emphasize that you really have to think about the specifics and the detail for individual products. Mm-hmm. General trend first. As we look over the time that I've done papers on launch excellence, we've seen an evolution from a situation in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when essentially the evidence package was clinical trial led. It was about getting approval and secondarily about getting access to budgets. And real world was there, absolutely, but it was not considered an equal partner to the RCT. Now, of course, we have a very different situation where real world data is seen as extremely important, not just because of HEOR studies, but for a very wide range of uses, maybe even included in submissions for example, particularly for rare disease products, and is growing in its utility and also the types of real-world data that can be generated, particularly as we see, for example, wearable devices and patient-generated data come into play as well. So that's the milieu that we're in. Of course, within that, if we look at specific products, there's going to be quite a variation dependent on the area that you're in. If you're in the orphan medicine area, it may well be that real-world data needs to be part of your submissions package, because we're talking about really challenging trials to undertake with very small number of patients. On the other end of the scale, if we look at the new obesity agents that come in, they have run, in the case of Novo Nordisk for Wegovy with Select, huge CV outcomes trials to conclusively demonstrate the cardiovascular benefit of treating the obesity. And we will see further CV outcomes trials in the obesity space going forward. So the first thing to really understand is that real-world data and its combination with clinical data into a fully integrated evidence package is a pretty diverse thing that you need to think carefully about the needs of your product and the disease area that sits in to really work out the detail of. But I think that the underpinning point that comes through in all cases is that it is more diverse than it was before, and there is a demand for more evidence than there was previously. And I think the pandemic has accelerated that, because the pandemic changed treatment patterns. It meant that doctors might be treating their patients more remotely than they would have previously. Certainly seen that in the UK, where a lot of GP consultations are remote now. But even in areas like cancer, where, of course, oncologists practically never saw their patients remotely prior to the pandemic. Now, for example, checkups and routine appointments, there's a greater element of remote treatment. We see, of course, patients who may be presenting with a particular condition, but they may also have long COVID or other long-term sequelae from the pandemic. That all changes treatment practices. Doctors are aware of that. They're saying, well, where's the evidence that says what is the best way for me to treat my patients in this environment? And if you're bringing in a new product, I think you've got to have evidence that answers that question, that says how your product, your new launch, is going to benefit patients in today's treatment environment. And that's largely going to be about real-world data, I think.
Great. Thanks a lot for a very elaborate and precise answer as well. If I move to the US, and you already told us a little bit of difference in engagement there, but also I think I maybe read that in the report, but just US often take up a lot of, it's an important country for launch, take up quite a big portion of market. You mentioned some of the drugs also being here in Copenhagen. Of course, we pay a little bit of attention to Novo Nordisk's new obesity drug, and then the US is a really important market, for instance. So my question, I don't know if they have data on that, but I've also been in a pharmaceutical company myself, and there was the question of sequencing. There's something about, how do you do that sequencing? Maybe had the US been such an important market. So sometimes there was an argument to go very fast into the US, given the number of years you have exclusivity. On the other hand, there was this argument, something to discuss whether to have some experience, in some less important markets, if I may say so, in terms of revenue. Do you have any reflections on that, or any insight into that trade-off?
It's a good question. I have to say that over the time that I've looked at launch, the sequence of launch markets hasn't changed a great deal.
Okay.
It's been pretty well established. The vast majority of new global products will launch in the US first. Then they will come into Europe, and in Europe, Germany and the UK have typically been early launch markets. France, Italy, Spain, a little later. A lot of the other European countries a lot later. Then Japan, and historically China was way down the ranking. The sort of changes that have happened really have been China moving very rapidly up the rankings as its regulatory reforms and the focus on innovation really accelerated the interest for that market for innovation, because of course it became the world's second largest pharmaceutical market by value a lot earlier than it became really interesting for innovative prescription medicine launch. And also Japan, which had historically been a slow country for the uptake of innovation, becoming a faster one and moving up the sequence as well. The European countries and the paramount position of the US didn't so much change. Now, we can look for the remainder of the 2020s and ask, will that continue to be the case? Because we have got maybe some big macro pieces of legislation that conceivably could have an impact. We've got the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. We've got the European pharma package of legislation. They're different in what they're seeking to achieve. They don't necessarily have launched products, as directly in their site in the case of the US anyway. And I don't think it is clear the way that it could change sequencing of global rollout of launch, given that the US is such a huge contributor to the first 5 years cumulative revenue for the typical new active substance. It's difficult to conceive that its first launch position is going to change for the vast majority of products. And whilst China has become more important, it's nowhere near threatening the US in terms of its number one position right now.
Great. Thanks for all the insight and the historical evidence there on that question as well. Maybe just in closing here, as we're burning daylight a little bit, the few hours we have here in December up north here in Copenhagen. But I'm curious still on the 6-month rule in the report. That as I read it, as your insight is that the first 6 months of a launch is very significant for the trajectory of the success of a drug. So, are there any insights around that, or is around that 6 months rule? Does it vary a little bit from maybe different type of drugs or therapeutic areas?
Okay, well, it's been one of the perennial insights from all of the studies that I've done since 2007, and probably also the one that I've been challenged on most in that time too, and also agreed with most. So it's definitely a talking point. Just for those who don't know what the 6-month window is, it's this. It's the observation from the data that across countries and over time, 80% of launches tend to continue on the trajectory that they've established in their first 6 months, whether that is a really good trajectory or a poor trajectory. And only 20% or fewer of launches start on a relatively poor trajectory and then manage to make a significant improvement post 6 months. It's important to establish that, because sometimes people say, oh, the 6-month window says that if you don't succeed in your first 6 months, you're never going to succeed. It doesn't say that. It just says that that first 6 months is really important, and going from a position where you have a lower trajectory in that first 6 months to a really strong trajectory is really tough. But companies do it. Products do that on occasion. Far better, however, to plan to be in the group of launches that start well and continue well. And this is where we get to why some companies really welcome this because it's a call to action about better launch preparation, pre-approval. You have to start on the right foot with your launch. And that means starting your launch preparation early and investing properly. And of course, while it might sound obvious that that is the thing you would do, in a big, complicated pharmaceutical company where you've got competing priorities, you're trying to make your quarters with your existing portfolio and things, it's actually pretty easy to deprioritize launch preparation and say, well, we can't start this quarter because we've got all these other things and we can't spend this amount, or we can't have our medical affairs team start to think about this launch in development at this point. And actually, that may well be a false economy for the future of your new launches and the future of your company. Of course, it's a challenging message if your product happens to be in the market and happens to be doing less well than you expected in the first 6 months. So that's why perhaps it's controversial. Now, I think that the other thing about the 6-month window is, we've seen it consistently over time. We even see it in Launch Excellence 8. Even with all the big changes that we've seen across the launch environment, it's still the case that the vast majority of launches start on the trajectory that they continue. There's been a little bit of loosening up, perhaps because of the pandemic, but not enough to break the 80-20 rule. What do I take out of that? You've got to still prepare. There's no substitute for excellent preparation. When we think about multi-channel launches, which of course, not multi-channel, multi-indicational launches, which of course many launches are, you should have considered that with each new indications launch, you've got a new 6-month window. So it's not the case that the first product indication you come in for is the one that determines the trajectory for all other indications. And of course, many products are multi-indicational now. So that's something to reflect on too. But it still holds. I'll look at it again in Launch Excellence 9 and see if it continues to hold.
Great, Sarah. Thank you so much. I'm going to close in just a minute. Any final piece you want to highlight, or that I didn't ask for in considering launches, or something that's especially important? Other things you have already mentioned that we should take with us, some of us, or those of you who are marketeers, are bringing products to market here as the final thought.
Okay, well, I think we have to look forward, because launch is always about understanding the environment that you will go into, not trying to replicate the environment of your last successful launch. And we are going into a tremendously exciting era as far as launches are concerned, because the last decade and a bit has been about an increasing focus on specialty products, oncology products, often ultra-specialized products, and those will continue to be important launches. But now we have new innovation in mass chronic diseases of aging, whether that is obesity, cardiovascular, CNS, or elsewhere, pain, arthritis, and so forth. These are areas that when I wrote the first Launch Excellences were the leading blockbuster areas. It was primary care environment, and that went into abeyance, of course. Now we're seeing a new type of mass, chronic, high prevalence, primary care-led innovation, and how those products will be introduced, given all of the challenges that I've talked about, is going to be enormously interesting. I almost feel like we're starting to come full circle here. And we've got to ask questions about what learnings do we take from the recent specialty launch era, but also can we reach back in time to understand some of the primary care rules which may need to be remade for this new primary launch era.
Sarah, thank you so much. Thanks for your time, your morning, and to all our listeners, thanks for listening in. I just want to say that this was just a small highlight, some small snippets of some of the trends that Sarah follows in the life science markets. Those who are more interested and have a further interest in that, you're naturally very welcome to join our program in a year's time. Sarah's going to be hanging around in a year's time, visiting Copenhagen here, face to face, where we're going to discuss some of your real life cases, where some of the trends and insights and conditions and best practice that you can apply to your projects on the program. So thanks again to Sarah and to everybody listening in, and a Merry Christmas here in December 23 from Copenhagen.